Hello. I'm going to show you some of the differences between the traps in Wooden and the traps in Steamworks Extreme. Hopefully you can get an idea of what I changed and why. So, if we look at the first trap here, press the button, the wooden platformy things disappear, and they respawn again, and that's it, trap's over. So you can see that the area of the trap here is quite long. The players could probably only make about 2 jumps if they were trying to jump through it. So if they jumped about here, then they would probably survive the trap. It springs so quickly that there's very little time for them to escape. So it's quite easy to kill someone on this trap. So here we are in Steamworks Extreme B3A. I built Steamworks Extreme based on Wooden, and although this version was made quite some time afterwards with a lot of changes in detail, the traps are roughly the same, for the first half of the map at least. So here we can see the very first trap, which is the disappearing platforms. It works in more or less the same way, but if you'll see here, the platforms don't just immediately disappear. They fall like physics objects, and they do so in a randomized order. The reason for this is because, if you remember when I talked about the oh bollocks. I thought I killed you. You remember when I said people could jump over the original trap? Well, here, because of the fact that the platforms fall more slowly and in a randomized order, people who are jumping over it still have a chance to escape it. But they have to be very careful when they land their jumps, because if they choose a platform that's falling, they will die. So in a way, you can take a gamble by running across, but also if you see the platforms adjacent to you beginning to fall, then if you begin to jump yourself, you are more likely to survive it. And I felt this was important for the very first trap because I did not want the very first trap to be unfair, be very long, and to kill off several players. I wanted players to feel confident in setting off and not immediately stopping as they come out of spawn. Lots of people gathering in one area, waiting for the activator to trigger the trap, and then tentatively stepping out. To make it more difficult and realistic, because I don't like things magically appearing, instead of having the original platforms just spring back to life, I have these trains which come up from the bottom. And they present an extra challenge, because you then have to jump on them. Originally they were narrower, but when I playtested the map on Saxton Hell, I found lots of players were getting stuck on them and then pushing other people off. Because on Saxton Hell they have player pushing enabled. So I went back and widened the platforms. I felt that was best thing to do, and it made me realise that if you have a lot of players going through a narrow area, it really causes problems. So it changed the way I design traps. I now look at players flowing through a map like water going through channels, where at the beginning the water is very broad, but over time the channels can narrow and the water can fill in through streams and then trickles and what have you. Here we have flames. In the original version of Wooden, players would just die immediately, but in this version of Wooden I actually made a slight change, changing the damage of the trigger hurt to use the doubling with forgiveness mode, so people had a chance to escape before they died completely. The trap length is not that long, so it's fairly easy for people to jump out of it either way if they're quick, and the doubling with forgiveness gives them a bit of a chance as well. It's a nice simple trap, and it doesn't kill too many players, but it does take advantage of people who aren't off guard. And another thing is that you can reuse it after a fixed period of time. So if you have people who are rushing forwards, and you have to catch them up and then come back to get the stragglers, you still have the opportunity to kill them. This trap... Oh, I appear to have disabled this trap. That's a shame. Let's restart the map. The reason that happens is because I included a trigger where as soon as the runners were out of this area, it would disable these doors and particle effects. So, at first, I made this trap manual, but it was confusing, so I made it to be fully automated. You can see it's based on the original Flames trap, except now it's a bit different. It has gates, and it has 2 jets of flame rather than just the one. It's less simple, and what I did here was I experimented with the idea of traps that contain multiple elements. In this case, rather than having one automated element and one manual element, I have 2 automated elements. On their own, if you study them, they seem pretty simple. The doors open here, close there, and repeat. You can see that the doors are on their own timer. The flames, they are also on a repeating timer, but the timers that control the 2 sets of elements are not in sync with each other. They are slightly different. So the challenge here is not to jump over and just to avoid the flame, but it is for the runner to observe the trap and try to understand that there are 2 sets of timers going off and then work around that. So what they should do is focus on the flames and then wait for the opportunity to arise, jump through the door, and then immediately jump over to the other side, and then the other side again. The idea here being that players should feel they need to jump from platform to platform to avoid the flames. There is a short window of time to allow them to do that, as you can see. And in the auto mode version of this trap, the only change is that the doors remain closed for longer, which means that the players are forced then to spend more time jumping. I think the change in the timing between manual and auto mode is not very noticeable. It's difficult to portray that change in timing, so I think to make this trap a little bit less challenging in future, it would be best to just have either one set of timing over the other and then just keep it that way regardless of whether the map is in automated mode or manual mode. Previously this was just a platform that went up and down, I think. I'm not entirely sure. But here I put in this wooden platform thing which goes up and down, and as you can see it has no centre. So when players jump onto it, they have to be careful with their positioning, or they may fall through the hole and die. Here we have 2 basic traps. They're crushers. And they move at a speed which gives players a bit of a chance to react. You tend to have to activate them when people are about to run into them to try and catch them off guard. Also, you can see because of their width, it does give some time for people to escape. So those are pretty fair traps, I think. But because they're so simple and the catchment area is quite narrow, I made these reusable as well. I think it's okay to have simple traps reusable, especially ones which are obvious like this. Players can see them, they know what they do, they know what they need to do to avoid them. I stay over on the far left, will give you a greater chance of avoiding them because you have a chance to see them coming at you. Here we have the brushes again. They do more or less the same thing. There's a bit of a difference here though. It's mostly style, but it does have some practical purpose. You'll notice that they take very slightly less time, or more time, sorry, to reach their full extent, and then they hold in place for a bit of time and then start to withdraw slowly. The reason they hold in place is just to serve as an anti-rushing measure. So say you needed to catch up with somebody and you wanted to stop people here, you could quickly trigger one of the traps and then you could use it as a temporary blocker just to stem the flow. This trap here sucks people off into this room. The trap catchment area is a good size, it's not too large, and if players are running forwards with the conveyor here, they have an increase in speed. So perhaps the best strategy would be to just stick to the far left and run straight through. It's not an unfair trap, it can only be used once though. Here we have some gas. I think it just kills people really. I think it just has a doubling with forgiveness damage. It's fairly simple, but the problem is that because the dust particles move slowly, it can be difficult to judge when the trap is dangerous or not. So when you find yourself in this trap, then you can find it feels a bit unfair. Here we have the conveyor belt as before, but rather than having a fan here with the door off to one side, which I felt was a little bit cheap and done already in other maps, I changed it to be a kind of a static hazard. So you can see that the conveyor belt, they both don't go in the same direction now. They both lead you towards this grinder. So the challenge is to use the speed of this conveyor belt to jump over onto this next conveyor belt and then to continue moving forwards, because if you don't, or if you fall short, you're going to get pushed into the grinder. And then running with the theme of having an automated hazard or a trap with multiple elements, we here have a manual element, which is like a gas leak, and that does gradual damage over time. So if players run and jump into this area and then the gas starts, they can immediately turn around and use the momentum provided to them by the conveyor belt to jump back over to this other conveyor belt. So in a way, they're kind of using part of the trap's dangerous aspects to their own benefit. Of course, if you're a little bit further forward, you may find it better to just continue to walk forward, and in that case you have this short space here where you must modulate your speed and sort of balance on the spot to make sure you don't fall back into the trap behind you. Another thing is that you cannot run straight ahead here onto this automated section without first observing the order of the rotating platforms. And if this map is in automated mode, then the gas comes on and goes off on a repeating cycle. So you're forced to wait here and modulate your speed ever so slightly until you are comfortable with the pattern. So this whole section here kind of forces players to always move. They've always got to modulate their speed. They've always got to keep their position. I wanted to create a section where people had to continually move all the time. So all the way from over here, all the way to over here, and through here, with the exception of some places, because obviously you can pause on there. And as you go through the course, you must change what you're focusing on. Try and keep that timing in mind. Here, these things are straightforward. They are just platforms that shoot down. If anybody were to jump from here, then they would land on either of the three platforms, and if they were activated whilst the player was in the air, all they needed to do would be to adjust their movement in the air to make sure they land on one of them. They take a little bit of fall damage, but they wouldn't die. So it's a pretty straightforward trap to avoid. So you should be familiar with this one. It's the same as before, but I thought the original trap was a bit boring. Pretty easy to avoid. Didn't really have a place halfway through the map, so I made it sort of automated and moving all of the time. So there's still three of them, and what you'll see here is that they're track trains, and they move up and down. They can go all the way to the top or all the way to the bottom. They have this kind of bit in the middle where they stick around most often, and they constantly move between the 2 points. The only thing that changes is their speed, and the speed is changed between 2 settings, and the speed change is controlled by a timer which has a random value. What I wanted to do here was create something that was unpredictable, that represented a challenge. And so as you're travelling down here, you're sort of forced to go forwards. You can't jump back onto the previous platform. So if you hastily jump down here without paying attention to these platforms over here, you might find yourself in a situation where you're stuck and you can't jump onto anything. So you have to time your progress down these rotating spike trap things and make sure that you match up with a time where one of these platforms is within jumping distance. And then you need to jump from one to the other, which means you need to wait until one is below the one that you're currently on. You have to look at the direction they're going, because if you jump now, for instance, you'll be screwed. So this was a test of runner patience, really. And when you're on the final one, or even on the second one, if you've got enough momentum, going at a faster speed, you can jump down to the platform at the bottom. The trap zone here is about what you can see. The trigger hurt is the same dimensions as the rope. So I suppose the best strategy here would be to go through the right hand side. The water gives you an indication that there's an electrical hazard here. And when you trigger the trap, it electrifies once and then turns off. And then it electrifies again a short time afterwards. The reason I did that was because I wanted to make players think that the trap was safe, but then a half a second later it would activate again, which sort of simulates an electrical arc, but it also keeps players on their toes a little bit. So, onwards. This is a rare time when I would have people staring down onto a trap. Not something I usually like to do, but at the time I just found it easier. And it's such a long trap, and there's a massive gap between this area and the next area anyway, so there's plenty of time for people to catch up. I don't really think this trap has an original in wooden. I think this was something which I created myself. I wanted to have something where saw blades would come towards you and you had to jump. But then I thought, why have a standard floor where people could just run? Why not make it so that you had to jump over a gap? So I started with the gap being a bit more narrow at the beginning, and then the gap being wider in the centre. So people could try and do it here or run into the middle area, and it would make it more dangerous, or they could go back here. So let's have a look at it. The pattern and timing of the saws is different in manual mode and automatic mode. There are 4 saws that can spawn. Here I think there were 8. There's a logic case which uses pick random shuffle, which chooses the sides and positions of the saw blades. I spent a long time adjusting the speed of the saws that they move, and also the time between saws, because obviously, you know, it takes some time to jump from one side to the other. There's also the reaction time. I also spent some time tuning the time it takes for these doors to close and when they close. So I didn't want people to get to the end, begin to jump, and then the door immediately close and block them, and then they fall. So there's a little bit of time for people to escape here, and that's why the doors don't close from the bottom up, they close from the top down. So if you see the door start to move, you can judge whether or not you should continue or stay here. It is possible to get between the saws as they're still spawning and jump off at the end, I believe in auto mode the time between saws is increased slightly just to allow you to get through, because otherwise you'd have a non-stop barrage of saw blades that you wouldn't be able to bypass. So in manual mode the idea is that you're trapped and you must avoid the saws, and in automated mode the idea is that you must battle through the saws. Originally we had lasers here and a crusher, I think. I believe both lasers were activated at once, I'm not entirely sure. But because the lasers are so narrow, it can be difficult to actually get somebody. I think the best way to try and catch somebody on this trap is to trigger it before they run into it, catch them off guard. And because it's so narrow, I allow people to use it more than once. Again, it's an example of a simple trap which comes later on in the map, so by this time the bulk of your players will be dead and split up. So if you find you've used a bunch of traps over there to try and kill one person, but you've already used all your traps up until now, you've run out of traps really, so the people hanging behind, they're guaranteed to win. But now with these reusable traps, you always have a chance of finishing people off who are intentionally stalling or straggling behind because they want other people to sacrifice themselves. This section is inspired by Wooden or Steamworks, the original Steamworks, and it's actually a combination or an expansion of its original trap. You'll remember that I showed you the lasers in Wooden. Well, in Steamworks Extreme you also had a crusher that came down from the ceiling. Well, here I've kept the same idea, but I've expanded it, so you now have two crushers, you have 3 sets of lasers, and the idea isn't just to avoid lasers or avoid the crusher, it's to it's to try and capture the runners by using the lasers carefully. So runners, when they approach, they should be able to see the laser emitters on the ceiling and on the floor. Perhaps not at the moment, they're a little bit difficult to spot. This area could use a bit of extra illumination. But these two crushers are on a repeating cycle, they always do the same thing. So what happens is you go through them and that's it, congratulations. But the lasers, you also have to contend with those as well. And this is what happens when I press one of the lasers. You hear a short spin-up sound effect, and about half a second later the lasers come on for a few seconds and then they go off. There is a slight delay after the activation of the button because it's too easy sometimes to just press the button as somebody's walking through. But the idea of this trap is that you're supposed to trap the runners whilst they're making their way through the crushers. So if somebody wanted to come through here, let's say, they would now wait, they would go through, you would stop them, and then they'd have to run backwards quickly or they'd get crushed. Now, not a lot of people seem to know to use it very well. I have seen 1, possibly 2 people, but you also have the other lasers to use as well as extra traps, just to take people off guard. Not a terribly difficult trap. I would probably move this further up, but I really like the concept. This trap is about touching the barrels and exploding. It's fairly straightforward. It's simple. It relies on player skill. It was present in the original Steamworks. I do not believe it was present in the Wooden port by Cal. This is based on the moving metal barrels from earlier. Movable metal barrels, which explode when you touch them. But in order to make this a bit more challenging, I increased the number of barrels. I also made sure that they weren't parallel, so as you go through them you also have to steer around them. I put them at the edges of the jumps here. You can see that the first set of barrels all have a width of about 64 units between them, which gives the players enough room. So they have to first carefully go through here, jump up and then onto the next platform without touching one of the barrels. Then they have to weave through a barrel. And then we get here, they have to jump from this portion to the centre. You can see that I've moved the barrels backwards a little bit, so there's a bit of room, but it requires a lot of precision. And then the final jump, there's a bit of a larger gap here. You must jump over these barrels. It's tricky, so you have to jump early. That's why I've given people more room. So this is about jumping precision and care. Also, because I wanted to reward heavies, which on our old server, Stevie's server, had their original run speed, but they had a higher health pool, I made it so that a heavy could survive a blast from one of these barrels. So, as a kind of balance, the heavy has lower speed, which makes it more difficult for them to make the jumps, but if they make a mistake, they have a bit of recovery. They won't die immediately. This trap was rather unfair. You can see the black portions here are the ones that come out. So if you want to survive it, you need to be in the middle. Because these things move so fast, and the distance between them is only about 64 units, it's very unlikely to avoid them. And even if you do avoid them, you still have to jump up and down. It's a very long distance, and I feel it punishes players. You have to run across this and jump without falling in the thing, but you also have to contend with this. So in a way, this is a good example of a simple multi-element trap, where the players have one automated element that they need to worry about, and then a manually triggered element that they also have to think about too. But in practice, the manually triggered element is a little bit unfair. Perhaps if we had fewer walls, that would be a bit more fair. But it's just an example of an element that appears as if from nowhere, with no realistic reason. This is a new area as well. I took the idea of the exploding barrel props and went with a trap which consists of two elements. The first element is a giant rotating cog, which you have to jump to go. If you walk, it will take you a long time, so you must jump. And the second element, of course, is the static hazard of the bombs, where if you touch them, they will explode on you. Show the triggers. Oh, that was clever. Well, you can see them anyway. The bombs themselves are non-solid, so it's possible for somebody to go into them and then touch the triggers. And then, of course, the bomb props explode with a set explosion radius and damage. The radius, I didn't want people getting exploded from other people's bombs, so I think the radius is something like 72 units, so it's the distance from one bomb to another. And if you're a heavy, I think you can survive one bomb, which could be useful if you're not very good. If you stay towards the centre of the thing, you can get through to the other side more quickly, but there's more chance of you hitting bombs because the bombs are more dense here. If you stay on the outside, there are fewer bombs, but it takes you longer to get through. So how you get through the trap depends on your skill level. Very unlikely that players are slow enough to get caught by the spikes on the other side, but I just wanted there to be a decent reason why they can't just go around this way. Plus it was a good excuse to mess around with proper and dynamic models. Okay. You can see the information at the bottom there. Some traps are repeatable. Look for buttons that turn orange when pressed. Because repeatable traps was a fairly new thing in Deathrun, I wanted to give people a heads up that that kind of thing exists, and this is the first time that you encounter it in Steamworks Extreme. These buttons here, when pressed, go from green to orange to indicate that they are reusable, and when you can use them again, they pop back out and go green. And you can see here the LEDs or sprites follow a similar pattern. So when I trigger, red means danger, don't go. Green means quick, get through whilst you're not looking. And then the orange means, oh, this trap can be spring again, caution, beware, you know. Just using traffic lights, really. Also, keeping with the multi element theme here, you can see I created another static hazard of platforms, what people might call a parkour trap. I created several wooden platforms here. You jump from one to the other, and then that one to that one to that one, with some props here so that you can't just jump. Well, you can't do like bunny hopping or charging or whatever as easily, at least anyway. I'm sure there's people who can, I haven't really seen. But also there's chance for these platforms to fall. You can see that they're all connected via ropes, and that's not just for decoration. I wanted to show that if one of these platforms was to fall, it would take the others with them. So each of these platforms is connected by this rope texture. Oh, there you go. So when I went on this first platform, you saw there was a slight screen shake, and then the platform moved slightly, and it gave you a bit of time to get off. The chance of the platform breaking whilst you're standing on it is random. So if people are going through here, it's not guaranteed to happen. What I wanted to do was have elements on the map which could change and which were sort of randomised. So let's say you go through it multiple times and then you encounter something which is different that you've never seen before, or something which happens very rarely. It could be a platform that's broken, or a piece of decoration that's different, or maybe an alternative route that opens up, because I wanted to enhance the replayability of a map, keep it fresher for longer. And what happens here is that when these wooden platforms fall down, this automated platform here appears, and it has two buttons. When you stand on the first button, it well, either button in fact, it sends the platform all the way to the end, and then the platform comes back of its own accord, and then it just waits, I think, the next person to arrive. Yeah. It has two speeds. If you stand on the blue one, the speed of the platform will slow down. If you stand on the red one, 3 speeds, it will speed up, and the reason for that is because these steam traps are still active. So if you're waiting for the activator to bypass it, he might bypass it now, the steam shoots out, and then as soon as it turns off, you go quickly. Now, I had 1 or 2 people saying that this trap was exploitable with more than one player on there, but that's sort of the point really, or not the point. With 2 players on there, one person can make the platform speed up or slow down, so you kind of have to make a decision on whether or not you want to get on the platform with another player. It's wide enough to accommodate 2, possibly 3 platforms, and it's not possible to trigger both buttons at once. I think what happens is that the moment you step on a button here, then the speed will go to that button speed, even if somebody's already standing on the other one. So if that person on the front there wants to reclaim the faster speed, all they have to do is jump up and down. It's actually a trigger. 2 triggers there, as you can see, which initiate the speed when the player first touches them. So if one person wanted to be in charge of the slowness and one person wanted to be in charge of the fastness, then you could even divvy up the jobs and have a little bit of cooperation going on. I mean, that's unlikely to happen because by this stage of the map there's very few people left alive, typically about 3, and they're usually spread apart. That's something I don't like, and I wanted to address in future versions of the map. So here you can see the traffic lights indicating that the traps are in a state where they could be used whilst you're on them. And that light is obviously not something that I used in manual mode, but I think it was in automated mode. I'm not entirely sure. Oh no, come again. I think the lights are just there to draw the attention of the player to the ceiling, because apparently players don't often look up, and here they have a reason to look up. As you're approaching, you see these lights. The idea is to make you feel like there's something going on up there, and you can see these 6 chutes. So this is an example of another trap with two elements in it. One automated element, which is the fences going up and down. You can see they're electrified because the sparks here spark occasionally. And they've got danger high voltage on them and wires running away from this panel on the wall. And then the manually activated element would be these at the top here. So the player has two choices when they approach this trap. Either they can wait for the fences to go down and they can run all the way through to the end, or they can take it one by one. They jump on and then they stop there and then they focus on the ceiling intently to see any barrels coming down. And then when the trap in front of them, or the fence in front of them, comes down, they can jump onto that one again. So, yeah, because obviously if you're running straight forward, you have the advantage of speed and taking the activator unawares, but the disadvantage is that a barrel may actually fall on you and you wouldn't see it. So here, if you take it more slowly, then, you know, you actually have time to sidestep the barrel coming down. So let's say you're standing in the middle, which is the best place to stand because you have an equal distance between either side, and I trigger the left one, or the right one, then you would see that barrel and you would immediately sidestep to avoid it. Simples. The only problem here is that there's no indication that each of the chutes has been used, so anybody coming across it would not realise that the trap has already been used, so they'd still be as careful. In the future version I would probably make it so that you could see that the trap had been used, or maybe even make it repeatable, I'm not entirely sure, but with a decent delay between each activation. I don't really think this has any equivalent in wooden, to be honest. I think from this point onwards I just sort of did my own thing. I had worked out my trap design philosophies. So I had worked out my trap design philosophies, having traps with multiple elements, some automated, some manual, where people have to focus on more than one thing, and I wanted to run with it, coming out with all my ideas. Here the player has already been introduced to the concept of electrified fences, and so they are familiar with that concept, and they can keep that in mind when going into the second one, which is a combination of static hazard and manual activated hazard. Everything here is electrified, as evidenced by the occasional sparks. A player must crouch. If they don't, or if they touch the fence, they will die. And they have these narrow entranceways here, and when I press the button they move in the opposite direction. Now I made it wide enough so that if a fence moves whilst the player is going through it, there is a chance for them to avoid it if they're quick enough. And I did the same thing down here. When you're crouched you drop down. Now here you actually have a bit of a chance to give yourself a break. You can let go of the crouch button and you won't die, because I don't like holding the crouch button down for a long time, and I'm sure other people don't as well. You get fatigued. And it was also to give people a bit of a pause to try and work out what has changed. These bits here go sideways and these bits go backwards and forwards, which is more difficult because there's more things that change, there's more things that you have to weave through. You can see it's a kind of a slalom thing, and if you are about to go through one of these gaps, then you might find that it closes off to you. Now the problem with this one is that they move so frequently that it's extremely difficult. So I think I would need to adjust the difficulty on this one. Either make them slower or give the player some indication that they're about to move. Maybe a noise before they move, a beeping sound or a light. But I was quite happy with it overall. I liked the concept, so I stuck with it. But it does need a bit of tuning. So onwards. This area is completely new. It's not based on any original traps on wooden. I wanted to do something different using the design philosophies that I'd created. So I will only go through them quickly as they're work in progress. I wanted to create a long section where if you fell into the water, you would be pushed back. And as you can see, this whole area is underwater. If I let myself float freely, you can see there is a slight push. So the idea is that you have to get through the back, avoid these things, and then get back onto this platform and start again. So you have these kind of spinning turbine things which are difficult to get across. If you touch the outside bits, you take damage. If you fall, there is a chance you'll hit one of the exploding barrels. So those are kind of static hazards in a way. And when you're floating back here, if you're not careful, you could bump into one of them and explode. The concept was going to be a kind of overhead rail or conveyor of barrels, exploding barrels, that would go all the way through. The barrels would spawn and they would be carried through on a kind of train, and then when they reached the destination they would be killed. And the reason I wanted to do that was because this area here has fans that blow you upwards. The idea being that you need to use the momentum of the fans to get over the obstacles here, but also avoid the overhead barrels and avoid these things that come out from the sides, which are manually triggered. I wanted to use upwards motion from fans in a way, and this was the first idea that I came up with. It's not perfect because you take some falling damage. Don't quite like that. If I were to do this, I would probably put the place that you land at a slightly higher position so that the falling distance is less and you are climbing rather than getting over an obstacle. This area here was inspired by Half-Life, believe it or not. There's a place in Half-Life, it could even be something like Blue Shift, I can't remember, where you must jump from one large kind of piston thing to the next, although they're on a much larger scale and they move more slowly. The automated element is the electrified beam here, or laser beam, which comes from behind and is on a repeating cycle. So if you don't pay attention to that and you're too slow, you may find it catches up with you. The manual element is when I press the button, everything pauses and then starts to go in the opposite direction, and that's repeatable. The slight pause is to tell you something is wrong and that you should change what you're about to do. The problem here was that I'd started to create automated traps and I was moving away from manual activation, and the problem is that Deathrun is built around the manual activation of traps. It forces one blue player onto the other side, so without anything to do, that blue player could feel pretty useless. There is also a possibility that you can fail your jump and go onto the cylinder here. It doesn't immediately cause you death, you actually have the chance to get back on, and I thought that was interesting as well because it rewarded players who could think quickly. So I do like this idea, but it's not really difficult enough for this area, I think. Perhaps it could be used as a kind of mini game or an alternative route. Still think it's pretty good, and maybe even going around corners as well. Okay, so the idea here is I was wanting to make Deathrun maps in a kind of a story arc. So when you get to the end, as you'll see in maps like Safety First, you have a kind of crescendo where things come together. You have a direct confrontation with the activator in his bulldozer. I didn't want to do the same thing again because I didn't want to steal other people's ideas, so I came up with a kind of a gauntlet where you're forced to move through a set of traps at a constant speed. You can't avoid moving through them, and as you can see here, the lasers. the activator could trigger them. This idea here is kind of a two-stage trap. You can see that these are reusable. They just spawn bombs from either side of the area, and the side is selected at random, so players on the platform have to keep an eye out on both sides. And the rate of the bombs is limited so that you can't just flood it. But half of the idea is to choose a bomb which is going to land on the player. The other half is to get as many bombs on this platform as possible, because in the next stage you're going to be firing barrels at people. So what the runner may not realise is that you have created a kind of a danger zone for them. This platform with its bombs now serves as a kind of an obstacle course in itself. And so when they turn around the corner and find they've got these barrels flying towards them, they then realise that by ignoring the bombs, they have made things more difficult for themselves. So what I did was, bombs are physics objects and they can be knocked off by the runners ever so carefully. If you crouch next to one of them or very close to them and then you melee hit them, you can actually knock them off the platform. So in a way this was kind of a back and forth between the activator and the runner. So the runner can make things easier for themselves in the final chase. Unfortunately, people rarely get to this area, and usually it's only one person, and it's usually the very smartest and most skillful players, and they know what to do. So I think this does require a bit of tuning. It's not as climactic as I had hoped, but it's work in progress, hence the dev textures, and some servers still seem to run it regardless. So that's the differences between Wooden and Steamworks Extreme. I hope you enjoyed this comparison. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Discord server. I shall be happy to answer them.